Yeah, I always think everyone has a plan until they get hit, right? And I think
whose
that's
phrase
Tyson.
was that? That was it. Yeah.
Tyson. Everyone has a plan until they get hit. So I think there are a couple of bits to this. From our perspective, the role of strategy is a need to keep us focused on what matters and keep us focused on how we achieve our clients' goals. Without clear strategic thinking, we'll talk about tactics later, but you can easily get mired in tactics first. But from my perspective, we use strategy, strategic thinking, and strategic frameworks to keep us focused, to keep us clear on our objectives, and to bring both the clients we work with and our own teams along with us and keep us clear on what we're looking to achieve. When we're initially working with a client, it's often very important to establish the way we work and the way we operate and the way we think. And I think strategy and to a certain extent the strategic framework is about being very clear up front and transparent on how we think about the way we're going to work with you and what we actually consider to be non-negotiable. There is a tendency in business and within agencies themselves to acquiesce, to jumping into doing something on request. Our belief, my belief, the reason that the framework exists and the reason why we've created a framework is that action without insight tends to be fairly ineffective, but insight is often the part that few people want to engage with. So what it is a statement of how we operate as well as a statement of what we consider to be the most important way and what we also know to be the way that success is achieved. In the creation of the framework, we did a couple of things. We both kept it very simple, so 5 stages, which is very hard to disagree with, while at the same time making it deep and comprehensive in terms of how it operates for the strategic as a business and also what we've seen work for our clients in the past.
But it's a structure and guiding principles that provide the ability to align lots of disparate parts towards a central objective or goal, but without compromising the need for flexibility or adaptability, because there are always going to be variables that you cannot control outside of it. Strategy like Shang Tsung's, Art of War, a tome of a book, but ultimately you can never really control until a situation actually then unfolds. If you're launching a particular campaign or a marketing strategy, you don't know if the entire world's going to shut down due to a global pandemic, or if your particular campaign goes viral, or actually incredibly resonates with the market to the point where competitors start replicating or cannibalizing what you're doing.
Yeah, I always think everyone has a plan until they get hit, right? And I think
whose
that's
Tyson. Was that? That was it. Yeah.
Tyson. Everyone has a plan until they get hit, and I think strategy and the way we approach strategy and the way we approach the framework is about building flexibility into what also needs to be a fairly rigid and definitive strategic plan. And when I say flexible and rigid, what I mean by that is there are certain elements of a business that are fixed, immutable, and unlikely to change the business goals and the resources that business has. But at the same time, as you put there, things change, economies change, the economic situation changes. There'll be a range of factors that change. Also, when you run marketing campaigns, you will find some of them work and some of them don't. There's a need to be flexible. And so when
some of them have to be able to take a punch.
Some of them get knocked out. Yeah. Whereas others are extremely effective. And there's a need from a strategic thinking perspective to recognize the need for flexibility while also recognizing the need to stay true to the principles and the outcomes that you're looking to achieve. And that's certainly one of the key aspects of the framework when we think about from insight to execution and the creation of the strategy itself. a business's needs and objectives will generally be fairly fixed. But the marketing campaigns and the strategy that underpins those marketing campaigns are likely to be flexible. And certainly when I think about the marketing campaigns that we run as a business, and we recycle or reevaluate every 90 days, that's part of how we think about strategic campaigns anyway.
And how does simplicity factor into that? Because we're guilty as marketers, all of us. You know, we love a model. We love a new structure or a new diagram. But I think from our positioning perspective, we're always pretty true to the fact that if we can't explain it simply, then we don't understand it well enough.
Yeah, and I would never be afraid of drawing a new model. I think my perspective on that is if I can't draw it, I probably don't understand it well enough. If I can't very simply articulate the principles behind the ideas that I'm purporting, I probably need to rethink it. By the same token, any of the ideas within the strategic framework are certainly not new. What is very important about it is that we adhere to them and that we don't deviate from them. And that is built around a need to implement and stay true to what we understand as driving success, both in the past and we know will drive success for our clients in the future.
And I suppose also the direction that we took was there's simplicity from a macro level, but it doesn't detract away from the value and sometimes the complexity and the expertise that then sits underneath that at a micro level. So although we've structured and we've taken an approach which is easy to articulate, it doesn't then detract away from all of the thinking that then sits underneath those.
Yeah, I think about strategy and strategic planning and the framework to a certain extent it's really a vehicle for the expertise and excellence of the business that is doing it. I always think of the example of someone saying, I won't give you my book idea because you'd write that book. And I always think, well, no, you wouldn't. It takes great skill and imagination to write a book in the same way it takes great skill, imagination, and experience to turn strategic thinking into strategic success. So you're right. I mean, the framework needs to be, and the way we think about strategy needs to be sufficiently simple that everyone can understand it and everyone can get on board with it. But ultimately, the reason that any of these strategies work is because we have people who have done this many, many, many times before and understand how to turn that idea into action.
Have you noticed any particular shift in thinking from clients and the people that we have been speaking to about their perception or approach when it comes to strategy and strategic thinking?
I think some are more open to it. I think by us being very deliberate and decisive about this is how we operate, I think you find that people come with you. I find people more open to operating from insight and research through to execution as opposed to just jumping straight into execution. But then is that a function of us not getting into work without an insights phase? I don't know. I think part of the pandemic drove people to, I genuinely think drove people to think more strategically because everyone felt wrong-footed, everyone felt off guard, and everyone felt like they could have done more. Those who happened to be in the right place at the right time, those who sold hand sanitizer were doing very well. Those who were in the travel industry probably are now thinking, we need to think strategically and we need to think about the contingencies we have in place. And ultimately, strategic thinking is about the ifs. It's about what if. It's not about just making a plan and assuming that everything will go towards that plan. It is about being able to think flexibly and think iteratively about what happens if things change.
Well, it certainly highlighted the need to almost rethink it. When you have an established strategy and you have those tactics that then sit underneath those, it's knowing that they can take that punch if needs be. And it is revisiting it rather than at the beginning of a 12-month period going, this is the strategy and it's going to be rigid and unchanged for the entire period. It genuinely did force a lot of marketers to take a step back and actually assess the appropriateness or the resilience of the strategies that they've had in place.
I like the idea of we're going to need to rethink this. I've always been a strategic thinker of this is not immutable and this is not fixed. And the idea that now people are going, do you know what, we need to be able to think on our feet, really comes back to how I started in strategy and how I think about strategy. And where I think strategy came from warfare, right? And it was a need to be flexible in order to take account for an ever-changing environment. And goodness, if the pandemic has now driven this idea that we have a flexible, ever-shifting mindset that takes advantage of opportunity and manages risk, then I mean, from my perspective, that's a dream scenario, right? And I think that's where StrategiQ's strength comes. Is we are a strategy business, right? And we don't just make plans, hold them in a rigid permanency, and then expect outcomes to come. We are by our very nature flexible and able to think on the fly as the opportunity presents itself and as issues do present themselves. So I think maybe from a strategy perspective, that is an outcome of this pandemic.
Yeah. Has that changed people's perceptions, or at least in your experience, about the difference or the understanding between strategy and tactics and the relationships of those?
It's an ever. I mean, the fact that those are this perennial subject of conversation means it probably hasn't been solved. I think the reason that we have this discussion is tactics are much simpler to understand and require less effort to conceptualize. Strategy is about vision, and strategy is about thinking about contingencies and possibilities and trying to and anticipating ideas. And that by its very nature is much harder than let's write an SEO strategy in inverted commas or a pay-per-click strategy, which I think really 9 times out of 10 is just an SEO campaign.
Yeah,
right? Yeah. And I think
well, you end up with multiple layers, don't you? You know, overarching strategy, sub-tactics per channel underneath that, but then each channel essentially having their own channel strategy to achieve their isolated objectives, but ultimately aligning that with the overarching strategy. It means that those sub-tactics are all pulling towards the same objective.
Yeah, and we'll often have a prospective customer come and say they'll need an SEO strategy, but invariably, if we're thinking about a channel in isolation, that thinking lacks a level of depth and consideration in order to be successful. I think you made a nice point there that in order for any marketing campaigns to work effectively, they must work in a consistent fashion around audience, message, and outcome, which are independent of any particular channels. And we'll often engage in extended conversations with clients who've come with the need for a website or an SEO campaign or a paid search campaign. And actually the reality is that we need to understand who we're talking to and what we say to them and what we need them to do by audience. And I think they're good conversations to have. But it does talk to the importance of strategic thinking, and that really should be independent of any channel thinking.
And how have all of these factors and influences then kind of helped us, or at least informed the structure and the approach to our strategic framework? As we were saying earlier, the strategic framework is simple, right? Insights, opportunity, strategy, targets, and execution, deliberately so. And so the thinking that the time we spent on thinking we did with it is that it is universal across business, across industry, across channel, across audience, across anything. So it has informed it in that the framework should fit any application for a business looking to achieve a particular set of goals, be they brand or business or revenue or whatever they might be. But then the framework also is built specifically for strategic strengths, our ability to operate in brand, to operate in digital, to operate in technology, in marketing, and to bring our advisory capabilities to bear as well.
And so it both has a simplicity to it that is applicable to really any business problem or any business goals, as well as a complexity that is nuanced and specific to Strategic themselves.
Whilst retaining the flexibility to be able to adapt.
Whilst retaining the flexibility to adapt, absolutely.
So from a strategic thinking perspective, are there any kind of key takeaways? And we've spoken about this a lot, the difference in the understanding between the relevance or the impact of certain tactics under strategy. But are there any guiding principles that you could impart the wisdom on when looking at your own strategy, whether that's critiquing what you're currently doing, assessing how resilient that might be, or even starting from scratch?
I mean, there are three things that I always think of. Do you know who you're talking to? Do you know what you're going to say? And do you know what you expect them to do? And I think if you can't answer those three key components, then you probably don't have a strategy. And obviously we're talking about marketing strategy right now. Strategy is obviously a far broader subject in a range of other spheres. But from a marketing perspective, I would say challenge yourselves to understand who it is you're talking to, and that might be many or it might be few, but actually be clear on who they are, what they need, and what you as a business say to them and what you as a business mean to them. And then be clear on what you expect them to do. And then your allocation and selection of resources and channels and messaging and platforms and all of that becomes secondary to this very clear idea of who I'm talking to, what I'm saying and why it matters, and what I expect them to do and why they would do it. Why would they believe in what you're saying? And as I say, if you can get those components right, then channel selection and all of the things that we do tend to fall in love with a little bit as marketers, ultimately becomes secondary. Your foundations are your customers, both current and future.
Yeah, we're often guilty as marketers as getting overly obsessed with the delivery mechanism or the tactic, so to speak, rather than the purpose behind it.
And also to think that we are the customer. I think as marketers, I find it funny that we do forget that this is fundamentally about who our customers are. But it's easy to get bound up in how brilliant we are and how clever we've been in the creation of a strategy framework, or how clever we are in the building of teams that can deliver against all of these channels. But ultimately, it boils down to who you're talking to, and that's your customers.